Hi, I'm Wiley Combs. I'm the editor-in-chief of News from Nowhere. This is in our series of This is Laramie video interviews, and our guest today is Matt Stannard, who works with Commonomics. He's also lived in Laramie for a while, and we're going to start off with that question, which is how long have you lived in Laramie, Matt?
Yeah, I've lived here for the better part of about 15 years. I did move out to the Midwest for a couple of years to do some work out there, but then I just returned this last year. So I like to say it's about 15 years.
And so what did you move to Laramie for?
I originally moved here because I was hired as the new debate coach at the University of Wyoming on just the cusp of 1999 and 2000. And at that time, I had coached college debate at a couple of other places, and then moved out to Laramie to take that job.
And how long did you coach the UW debate team?
I had the very distinct pleasure of coaching that team for 11 years. And then at that point, I had long thought that higher education was really not where I wanted to end up. I love it. Most of my friends are in it, but I wanted to do more political work. And so I went to law school in 2010.
And what came out of that law school education? Are you a lawyer now, or what do you do, man?
I'm not a practicing attorney, although I do a lot of legal and policy research for attorneys as well as advocacy organizations. My intent in going to law school was always to learn policy language and policy drafting, as well as legal history and legal techniques, to be able to be a professional agitator, basically. And I feel like that's what I do now. I'm pretty much a professional advocate. I work with local governments as well as grassroots organizations in drafting legislation as well as strategizing for political campaigns.
And what's the title of the organization that you work with?
Commonomics USA is the organization that I'm policy director at. That's a national nonprofit organization. It's an educational organization devoted to sustainable economics. I'm also on the board and do media work for the Public Banking Institute, which is a very similar 501c3 educational organization dedicated to democratizing our economy through public banking.
And can you describe what that looks like? What is public banking?
A public bank is a bank that is owned typically by a state or a city or a county. In the United States, the only actual bona fide public bank is the state-run Bank of North Dakota, which is about 100 years old. And what that does is it allows states to run their own banks and leverage lending through fractional reserve lending to basically lend money to themselves and lend money to small businesses, students, other people within their jurisdiction, instead of relying on private Wall Street banks to handle those financial transactions. And so there's a huge savings in cost, as well as there's a dividend that comes from that that's paid back to the state. So it's a great way to stimulate and preserve local sustainable economics.
And how does that interact with your work for Commonomics USA?
Commonomics USA includes a lot of that public banking advocacy. We also advocate for postal banking, which many people have heard Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren talk about, and that is banking, small-scale banking through the post office, which the United States actually had until 1967, very successful postal savings banks. Where we conceive of postal banks being important now is that we think that they would take the place of predatory payday lenders, predatory check cashing services, by allowing the huge economies of scale of the Postal Service to handle financial transactions and small loans for consumers.
And do you consider that to be a reasonable objective? Do you think that that's something that you are an advocate for, or is it kind of an interesting concept?
I'm really enthusiastic about the idea of both large-scale banks, infrastructure development banks like the Bank of North Dakota, as well as small-scale banking for people, for consumers. I'm excited about it because it takes the concept of banking, removes it from the realm of exclusively private ownership, and moves banking into the concept of a public utility. And I think public utilities are important. Public options, as some people call them, are important. They keep private entities honest, and they also have objectives other than shareholder profit. So a public bank can have, for example, as its objective, we're going to help the state of North Dakota transition into renewable energy and diversify its energy portfolio so that as we transition from fossil fuels, people are not going to be thrown out of work and we're going to have an easy transition. Germany is a country, for example, that has taken advantage of its public banking sector to switch its energy infrastructure to almost exclusively renewable energy. And they are able to do that because of the public banks as opposed to private banks.
So how is that received, that message here in Wyoming?
Well, some people thus far have been really receptive to it. I think that the dynamic of receiving that idea is the same almost anywhere. Community bankers in North Dakota who understand how the Bank of North Dakota helps them are really into it. Large banks don't like public banks because they see them as competition, but small banks see them as helping them, which they do. Sometimes people get a little suspicious because it involves two entities that people don't like, government and banks, two very unpopular entities. But I'm actually very surprised in my policy engagement at how many people would like to see more public sector engagement. For 40 years, we've sort of had it drummed into our heads that the public sector is bad and the private sector is good. But now that we've seen what privatization has done to places like Michigan, Detroit, for example, and having seen what privatization of water has done in a lot of different places, we see that people are starting to say, you know what, the public sector, maybe it's not so bad, and maybe the commons and maybe an economy based on cooperative economics would be an option that we could go back to.
So we talked about that as far as Wyoming is concerned. What does this do for, say, smaller communities like Laramie? Do you have any sort of objectives as far as that's concerned?
I would love to see Laramie be a testing ground and breeding ground for worker-owned cooperatives and other types of sustainable cooperative economic ventures. I think that Laramie's location as a university town and even people who are not affiliated with the university still include a great deal of extremely creative and innovative and entrepreneurial people. There's a real community spirit here, so I think things like worker-owned cooperatives, I think cooperative financial institutions, I think all of those things could be tried and tested here. And there's also just a really, really good environmentalist community here. And a lot of these economic cooperation ideas are also sustainable economy ideas, because if you have sustainable economics, then you're extracting less from the earth and you're exploiting people less and you're exploiting the environment less. And so the environment and economic cooperation go hand in hand, and I think Laramie could be ground zero for a lot of those experiments in Wyoming.
So aside from the theory of this, how would it be applied to a community like this? Because I don't think there are any worker-owned cooperatives in Laramie or even in Wyoming as a whole. What would the sales point for a community or for a group or for individuals in Wyoming be, or in Laramie in particular, for forming such a workers-owned cooperative, and what sort of industries would that apply to?
Well, almost any business could be a worker-owned cooperative. You just need enough people who are willing to buy into it, and you can get some support. There's lots of national grants and things like that that are available for cooperative startups. The real selling point for cooperatives is that all small businesses have a tendency to fail. If you just look statistically, most small businesses fail. Cooperative businesses fail at drastically much less a rate than LLCs and sole proprietorships and other types of small businesses. The reason for that is I mean, there's the economic reason is that you have a diverse set of ownership, and so not everyone has to wear all the hats, and so you're kind of taking advantage of human capital in that sense of everyone kind of having skin in the game. I think that there's also kind of a spiritual reason why cooperatives tend to succeed better than other businesses, and that is that both the co-owners and the clients or customers of the cooperatives feel like they have much more invested in terms of their values. They feel like they're supporting a business or running a business that is democratic and more conducive to their values. And so that incentivizes people to take better care of their business, or better care of the business that they frequent.
So we've spoken about the idea of what you'd like to see develop around Wyoming or in Laramie, including those public banks or those cooperative institutions. Are there any institutions that exist here in Laramie, any businesses or anything like that that you feel particularly attached to, that you think are an important part of this community?
I certainly think that a lot of the small businesses here are businesses that I feel a real strong attachment to, including Big Hollow Food Co-op, which is a consumer co-op. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit different than a worker-owned cooperative, but still, one of the nice things about a consumer co-op is, again, people kind of feel invested in the idea that they're doing something special. In the case of Big Hollow, people are running and kind of co-owning this place where you can get decent food for people. So I like that. I'm also good friends with the folks who owned the Earth, Wind, and Fire Gallery. Mm-hmm. And along those lines, I'm always happy to see the number of little galleries here, the number of little boutiques here. Mm-hmm. I like the fact, and I think I told you this one time when we were talking, when I first moved here, downtown was not really, I think, living up to its potential. But in the last few years with the farmers market, which I think is another great endeavor, and the various different downtown development processes, I enjoy being here. I enjoy the fact that my kids are here. I love walking with my kids downtown during the farmers market. Mm-hmm. I love the look of the downtown. It's rustic and also kind of modern at the same time. I like the coffee shops. I think you can almost always find me at Night Heron. You can always find my kids sitting there doing their homework at Night Heron. So I think there's just a lot of great places. Grounds, which is another coffee place right next door to this building, is also a place that I love to support. So I'm a real fan of the small businesses here, and I would love to see them grow, again, cooperatively, because we're better together than we are apart.
So do you think that there is room for interaction between your cooperative business model and the current small businesses that live in this town?
I think so. One of the things that I've done as part of my job is I've interviewed a few of the co-owners of co-ops around the country, including there's a bunch of tech co-ops out in the Bay Area in Northern California, which wouldn't surprise you. There's a lot of tech startups there. But again, one of the things that these folks that I interviewed said was, it's really funny because we don't even necessarily see other businesses as competitive. Mm-hmm. We find a way to work synergistically with businesses. And you can definitely do that. I work for a lot of attorneys, obviously, because I have a law degree, and I've noticed that attorney firms are often de facto worker-owned cooperatives. Right. And I've also noticed that attorneys around the same town cooperate much more than they compete. So for example, you walk into one attorney's office and you say, I need to do a bankruptcy, or I need a divorce, or I need you to help me with my property disposition or something. And that attorney might say, I don't do that, but this guy down the street does. Mm-hmm. Or I do that, but I'm full up, but this woman down the street does. And I'm going to have you call them right now. We're going to call them from my office, and I'm going to give you that referral. And cooperative businesses, whether they're actual co-ops or sole proprietorships or LLCs, often do that too in towns where there's a healthy economy and a cooperative ethic. And that's what I would like to see. I've never been a fan of of cutthroat capitalism. I always feel like cooperation yields more external benefits to everyone. And so I would like to structuralize that here in any way that we can.
Well, that's a very good note to end this on, and it's been a very interesting conversation. I think that you and I will have more to talk about in the future. For now, I'm Wiley Combs. I'm the editor-in-chief of News from Nowhere. This is Matt Stannard. He's with the Public Banking Institute and also Commonomics USA, and this is Laramie.